Hi, everyone. I'm Eric Brynjolfsson, and welcome to this special edition of the Stanford Digital Economy Lab seminar. We're very privileged to have Professor Diane Coyle joining us from the University of Cambridge, where she co-directs the Bennett Institute. I've admired her for well over a decade and finally gotten to know her a little bit the past 5 or 6 years, and become a good friend. She's been very helpful in helping me understand a lot of what's happening with the measurement of the digital economy better through a series of books and articles and research projects. And today she's going to talk about the measure of progress, counting what matters. Her new book, this is, I think, her first book talk. Is that right? Or yes, her very first book talk on this. So you get a chance to hear from that. Those of you in the room, if you have a question, just raise your hand. What we usually do is sort of clarifying questions during the talk, and maybe we'll have a little bit of time out towards the later part for more broader questions. Does that work for you, Diane, or how would you like to manage it? Yes. Okay, I think that's a good way. So we'll start with just if you have a question about something specific, ask her, but then we'll hopefully have some time to go broad in. And online, you can use the Q&A function there on Zoom, and we'll be monitoring your questions as well. So with that, welcome, Diane. Thank you for coming and joining us today.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Eric, and for the invitation. I'm going to start with a couple of apologies. One is that I arrived from London yesterday, and it's about 1 o'clock my time. So if I start falling over my words, that's why, and please forgive me. The other is that there are some people here who heard me talk earlier today in the workshop, and there will be a fair bit of overlap with what I said then. But that gives you an opportunity to ask the questions you didn't get around to earlier. So hello, everybody online as well. I'm really, really pleased to have this opportunity. We've had a fantastic day talking about these measurement questions, including, of course, GDPB, which Eric and David and the team here have done so much to pioneer. And that is, of course, directly about this question of what do we mean by economic progress and how do we measure it? And as I was preparing, luckily it turned out that what do we measure was unexpectedly in the news, with the Commerce Secretary suggesting and Elon Musk suggesting that we should remove government spending from GDP. Now, anybody who's done economics will be familiar with the GDP is equal to C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And if you are worried that the G bit isn't going to grow very quickly, or indeed it's going to collapse, then taking that out might seem like a good idea because you'll get higher growth figures than you would if you left it in. There are catches as well, of course, that one might want to think through that would show the US to be relatively much poorer compared to other countries than if we were to leave in the G. But it isn't an absolutely crazy question, whatever you think the motivations for raising the issue were. Because the origins of GDP were very practical. It was a measure devised during the Second World War. And so this is, for those who know their D-Day history, this is Utah Beach, American troops landing, fighting in the Allied war effort to preserve democracy in the free world. GDP had been invented during the early 1940s as a means of understanding how to manage demand in the economy and capacity in the economy to ensure that as many resources as possible were going to be directed towards the war effort and contribute to success. It's a story that I tell in one of my previous books, GDP, A Brief But Affectionate History. And for those who are interested, there's this excellent history of the wartime origins, Keep from All Thoughtful Men. It was a defense secret, that discussions about how to measure the aggregate economy, how to measure these capacity issues was a defense secret. So the debate at the time was therefore pretty clear that that was going to be the formula used. But among economists, there was a different debate about whether there should instead be a measure of economic welfare or economic progress. Because the things that you put into this GDP metric to measure aggregate demand and how close the economy is to operating at capacity is different from a measure that you might construct of the aggregate economy to understand how people's living standards are improving considerably over time or not. And the question of what to measure always becomes an issue at times of transformation in the economy. So here I am looking pretty smug because I'm holding a copy of William Petty's Essays in Political Arithmetic, one of the earliest attempts to construct an aggregate measure of the economy. Again, it had its origins in war, this time war between Britain and France, and the idea was to understand what the taxation capacity of the economy was for the British government of the day. Now, I'm looking really pleased in this photograph because this is the very copy of William Petty's book that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels used in Manchester when they were writing the Communist Manifesto. And the insight they had was that at a time of great structural transformation in the economy, it matters what you measure. You can't understand the forces that are changing people's lives, changing production, without focusing on these measurement questions, because measurement questions are really conceptual questions. How do you understand what's happening? And this was 1842. At the time, the signs of the Industrial Revolution were becoming very clear, but the statistics were not there. And when we think of that time of transformation, we think about the tech, we think about the cotton machines, the spinning and weaving machines in this top left-hand image here, or we think about the railway, the steam engines, the coal mines, all those archetypal images of the technologies of the Industrial Revolution that drove modern economic growth, that escaping the Malthusian trap so that for the first time over a long period of time, incomes per capita could rise consistently. But it wasn't just about the tech, it was also about the broader social and economic consequences, with a lot of focus in the Victorian era on the great inequality, the poverty, the misery of working class lives in these new industrial centres, these rapidly growing but in many ways miserable cities. And so on the one hand, you could see amazing technologies. On the other hand, you could see all of that misery. So we think about Dickens and similar authors writing about these things. But it was also, as in this last image, a time of transformation in consumption, the way people spent their leisure time, and the beginnings of the emergence of a prospering middle class who had spare income to spend on consumer goods as well. So here I've shown people happily on holiday, but it was also a time of expansion of things like purchasing pottery, Wedgwood pottery for your home, and other domestic goods. And think about all those Victorian houses full of knickknacks that people were suddenly able to afford to buy. So these times of transformation are always times when what you measure to understand how things are going becomes very important. It's important because it's about what changes productivity, what does the economy get out for the inputs that are used, for what's put in, and it's productivity that drives long-run improvements in living standards. And that happens when the processes of production change, the way that things are made changes. And here is an example of an old form of production in engineering and architecture. So here is a room of architectural designers. They're all men. They're sitting at tables with sheets of paper and they're drawing designs by hand. And this was the standard pattern for all kinds of occupations, white-collar occupations back in the day. Now you would see a room of people at computer workstations instead. And this is the kind of thing that they'd be looking at. This is a still image from an urban design company that we interviewed in the UK as part of a project trying to understand why producers do and do not adopt new technologies. And we visited a number of companies in different sectors of the economy, urban design, architecture, auto engineering, special effects and movie making, anybody who could use a real-time 3D visualization games engine, and it was the Unreal Engine from Epic Games. So this company had been, although using workstations, drawing 2D images of the large urban developments that they plan. And they would send these to be, they'd outsource it to another company to render them into 3D visualizations and also create 3D models. so that they could talk to their clients about what the finished development was going to look like. This is a big development in the east of London, and it's got around 20 buildings in it and a lot of landscaping, as you can see. When they adopted the games engine, rather than the 2D blueprints and the 3D models, they could do a 3D real-time visualization instead, fly their clients through and change it in real time. So if the client said, I don't like the brick building, I want them all to be the same color, that's easily fixed. And this helps save them a lot of money. It helps save them masses of time because the outsourcing process took several days to do, and there would be several iterations. And it enabled a better quality of service for their clients who can very quickly change what they want and get exactly what they want in the plan. So that raises the question, well, why doesn't everybody do this? And the answer seems to be that there's some standard economic costs. You've got to buy some GPUs and terminals. You've got to have the right kind of trained people to do it. But the big cost is adjusting that whole process of how you do things. And this was a small company, so the whole company had adopted the engine. In larger companies, only part of the business had, and that meant that they had not yet reaped the whole productivity benefits because the whole workflow couldn't change. Only one part of it had changed. So they'd only captured a partial gain. That kind of thing is hard to measure, and we don't have very good statistics on who's using what kinds of AI tools, and in particular, what they're doing with them. And it's all harder to measure what's going on in the economy when it's actually ideas that are driving the changes. An idea like a games engine or a new product is the kind of innovation that we're used to thinking about. We're used to thinking about gadgets and new pieces of software or patented products. But there are also many simpler examples. And so here's a frivolous one. If you find yourself late at night scrolling through Instagram, you might come across some of these life hacks. And so here's an example where you can change empty milk cartons into dustpans and spades to dig in your garden and so on. So this might seem frivolous, but actually it saves people money, it saves plastic waste, so it's got environmental benefits. And it's just a small example repeated many times across the economy of how the technologies are spreading ideas about how to do things differently. These can be patented ideas, so we can attach dollars to them and medical products might be there. But even then, we don't capture the full effects of the innovations on the outcomes, the improvement in people's lives from those kinds of innovations. And earlier today, Leonard Nakamura here gave us a great talk about that. So it's very hard to measure the impact added up across the whole economy of a lot more ideas being around to do things better. There's also something that I've been very preoccupied with, and that's the role of data in the economy. If you think about the handsets that we all have, these devices that we all carry around all the time, go back to the 1990s or 2000, and I was absolutely thrilled when I got one of these Nokia candy bar phones because it was the cutting edge of the technology at the time, and you could make phone calls and send SMS messages with it. Key moment came with the launch of the iPhone in 2007, and those initial apps that were installed there. So we then started to substitute some of the things that we would have bought separately for the apps on the phone. And so this move from things that you paid for, like watches or calculators, to things that are now bundled free with a device that, of course, you paid for and you paid for the data plan, but those services or products themselves moved out of the monetary economy. And then the apps became much more useful. And so we got things that embedded a lot of information, GPS information and geospatial information in map applications. And then finally, we get these user-generated content applications where there's real-time collectively generated information that we're all benefiting from. So how do you begin to try to capture all that in the economic statistics? And so one of my arguments in the book, this is just one example of a lot of digital phenomena where we are just not capturing what's happening, still less how to think about the value that people are getting from that. Now, we do need to remember that there are other aspects of progress and living standards as well. And it isn't all good news. You can't eat apps, and so we need to not forget that other things are going on. But technology has changed vast areas of everyday life. One example is retailing. So back in the 50s and 60s, you would go from shop to shop as a housewife in this example and ask for the things that you wanted from behind the counter. And that would be wrapped up for you and put in a bag for you, and you carried it away. Then we got supermarkets opening up, very exciting. I remember the first supermarket opening up in my hometown in the north of England in the 1970s. And that had checkout assistants who were going to key in the price that you had to pay and people to pack your bags for you. So there's a lot of labour involved here and a little bit of equipment. Next phase is we lost the people putting your groceries into bags for you. So that bit of paid labour went away, and we started doing that ourselves as unpaid labour. But the scanning equipment improved. So there's a little bit more tech involved and more unpaid labour involved. And then we have these automatic teller machines with quite sophisticated software to make sure that people aren't failing to pay or stealing things. Very little human labour compared to the supermarket of old. And then perhaps one day, all of the labour vanishes and we're just left with the capital equipment and the software, and all the work that's being done is being done unpaid by the person doing the shopping. So this extraordinary evolution, changing the mix of capital and labour, paid labour inputs, paid labour versus unpaid labour inputs, and the technological changes that have enabled that to happen. I've given an example in retailing, but this has happened in all kinds of sectors across the economy. The technology has changed the processes, and we're not capturing well who's getting the value from those changes in processes. There is value being created by the technology, but who is doing the work and who is getting that value? So one of my arguments in the book is that we should think a lot more about time as an accounting framework for what's happening in the economy. Because the great thing about time is that there are only 24 hours in a day, and we've all got the same allocation, and we've got to use it all. So it's a very nice accounting framework. It's a good way of thinking about productivity and process changes, because the key thing about process changes is they speed up things that can be made routine. And that's over history been a key source of productivity gains. It can also mean, I've got an image of time here, it can also mean better service. So on the one hand, you want to do some things much more quickly, and on the other hand, you want to take time and care and quality in delivering a service. So an example I give is in medical care, again, in healthcare, there are things that you would want to happen very quickly, such as taking a blood test and having an efficient appointment system and not spending much time doing that and getting the results really quickly. You want process innovation and that kind of testing. But if you're in an intensive care unit, you want the attention, many hours of attention from highly skilled people and a very high quality set of inputs. We can also think about household time. How are people in households allocating their unpaid time? And also, what things of broader economic value is that creating? Obviously, we're doing things that work for the household, like cooking food or caring for children or digging the garden. But people in households in unpaid work are now doing many things that create broader economic value, creating open source software, open innovation, that user-generated content like the Waze app that I showed earlier, and also things like online travel and online banking, where, like those automated checkouts, some of the work that used to be done in the paid economy is now being done in the household economy. And of course, given that we're here, the time spent using free digital goods as well, that's part of the time allocation of the household. So can we think about a time set of accounts for both production and household work and leisure? So that's one of the arguments. The other area I wanted to focus on today is the structure of production in the economy. As I said right at the start, that changed completely in the Industrial Revolution, and it's changing again now. And again, we don't have a very good handle on all of the things that we ought to try to measure. So I showed this slide earlier as well. These are examples of manufacturers who don't manufacture, or manufacturers who mainly provide services. So 3 of these examples, the iPhone, the ARM chips, and the Mercedes vehicle, are largely outsourced production. Apple doesn't make the iPhone. Mercedes doesn't make these particular kinds of vehicles. The middle one at the top is AstraZeneca. Its headquarters in Cambridge, where I'm based. And that's a company that has made strategic decisions at different times to do a different amount of outsourcing and talked about why it does that. And then the top right-hand image is Rolls-Royce, a major manufacturing company in the UK, makes fantastic jet turbines, but more than half its revenues come from a service that it provides, monitoring those engines in real time when they're flying airplanes. And so it can quickly tell if something is going wrong or if something will need repairing next time the plane lands, and have that done quickly. So we don't have particularly good data on these patterns of production. And this is becoming more important in the economy the more one worries about economic resilience, or indeed increasingly economic security, as we have been doing increasingly since the pandemic and the energy crisis. Because supply chains are the way that production is organized. But we don't think about counting the economy in terms of supply chains. We measure it in terms of sectors or occupations. But supply chains span many countries. There isn't a good sense of where the bottlenecks are. And if you are concerned at all, not only about what's the foundation for wages and prosperity in your own country, but also the resilience questions, then this becomes a key way to start thinking about looking at the economy. And more broadly, we need to start thinking about what assets can people access to produce in the economy. So this example is a rare earth mine in China. And of course, that's very much in the news at the moment because people have realized that specific rare earths are key inputs into all the digital products that we're using that are driving the economy now. But beyond that, understanding better what natural resources the economy has access to is also going to be key. Partly for access to resources, to oil, to rare earths and so on, partly also because natural resources have a very direct impact on people's health, and so human capital in the economy, and on questions like agricultural productivity. If you don't know what's happening to soil quality or erosion over time, then you're vulnerable to big falls in productivity in the agricultural sector. And another part of that asset base that we should be thinking about is infrastructure. This is, of course, the bridge in the harbour that collapsed probably a year or so ago now. Most of the OECD economies spent a lot on infrastructure investment in the immediate post-war decade and not much since. And so many countries are in a state of fragile infrastructure and very large infrastructure investment needs. So as well as time, the other thing I argue for in the book is a comprehensive balance sheet for the economy. Comprehensive wealth is the terminology used in economics. And this is important because it tells you about sustainability broadly understood. It's one thing to know what GDP or some other metric is today, but we also want to know, is that going to continue through the future? Will people in future have at least as high living standards as our citizens today? And we don't know that without some kind of balance sheet, or at least an understanding of what's the flow of services we're going to be able to get from these different assets over time. And on a national basis, so we know what we can access, and understanding the supply chains that will deliver them to producers in the economy. So that's the message. The book is a book in 2 halves. The first half is there's all kinds of things going on, transforming the economy, and we're not measuring any of them very well. And the second half is, here's what I think we ought to be measuring. It's partly looking at how is time spent in production and consumption, and partly we need to understand the comprehensive asset base that our economies can access. And I think this is only going to get more important the more that security comes to the fore in the current state of the world. I want to end with two plugs. You'll see from the slides that I'm co-director of the Bennett Institute of Public Policy, a public policy research centre in the University of Cambridge. We have just announced that we're becoming a School of Public Policy, launching in August, September, and this is our motto, the right kind of growth fairly shared. So please do follow us, and there's a lot more of this, the kind of research I've been talking about on the website there. And I hope you enjoy the book, and if anybody has feedback, please feel free to email me about it. So sorry for the repetition for those who were there earlier, and thank you all very much.
So there are many categories that aren't being measured well. What's your sense of where some of the biggest things that we're really missing? And how would you kind of categorize the categories? You laid out a few there. Are there some that you think are particularly consequential?
If you think about it in terms of what decisions do we want governments and businesses to think about making, I think I would put data at the top there, because we're in the midst of this next phase of the AI revolution. AI eats data, it produces data. And so a lot of people are thinking about what's the business case for investing in creating and maintaining databases themselves, what returns would they get? Governments are thinking about that too. The UK government has this idea for a national data library, and part of the conversation there is, should people be charged? If so, how much should they be charged? So this seems quite a pressing one. I don't know if it's the largest in terms of, what's the impact on our understanding of the economy. And then I think it would be understanding better production structures and how that's changing. But, we spent the day discussing a whole range of gaps in knowledge. And the good news there is it gives all of us who are working on it a fantastic research agenda, keep us busy.
Yep, that's for sure. Okay, Mike, yeah.
Thanks, Professor Diane. I think I have lots of thoughts aligned with you. And you talk about a lot about data and data value and data as labor. Actually, in the States, data is controlled by the large tech company, and it's valued, it's priced in the stock price in some way. But in Asia, some country, data was centralized and controlled by the government, and try to pricing the data. So which one you think, what kind of effect of these two models will be? What's the implication of two governing structure of the data? And do you have any idea about how to pricing the data?
It's a great question. The value of the data to companies that have a lot of it is partly a market power value. And there's a debate in competition policy circles about to what extent should those companies be required to share some of that data, at what level of aggregation. One example people point to is open banking in the UK, where the banks have been forced to release to consumers their own data so that they can then transfer it to another financial provider. So there's that aspect of it, and we probably wouldn't want to consider that as, if you like, true welfare value of the data, because it does reflect some market power. Then there are companies that use their own data effectively, and Eric has a paper on this, and there are a few others showing that if you use that data for something like predictive analytics, then you really boost your productivity premium compared to your competitors. So there's a value there that can be determined in terms of outcomes. How much does it raise productivity? And perhaps that will help companies that are not yet using their data effectively understand why they should invest in it and perhaps how much they should invest. People worry about governments joining up data for different reasons. And it might be that they fear surveillance or loss of privacy. it might just be that incentives between individuals and governments are not completely aligned. So you don't want the government knowing about all of the areas of your life. For an economist, the ideal outcome would be data markets. And there are a few. So financial data, there's a market for financial data. And if you think about why that works, it's because the data units are pretty standardized. And so you can think about trading them. So I think the challenge for a lot of data will be to think about what are the data units actually. It's not a volume measure like bytes, it's some kind of conceptual understanding of what the volume measure is. And there are a few tentative experiments to do that, looking at something more standardizable like CVs in a particular format. And does that give you a useful data market related to the labor market? But it's a completely open territory. I think it's absolutely fascinating. And governments and businesses are making decisions right now. So the sooner we can produce some more evidence for them, the better.
Thank you, Diana. Great talk. Only last week, the UN Statistical Commission endorsed the update of the system of national accounts. And, it goes some way, I think, in the direction that you mentioned. For example, data will in the future be capitalized, so considered an asset. There will be more measures on depletion of natural resources and a number of other things. I'm still interested in your take on these changes and also whether some of the measures that you put forward, do you see them as integral part of the accounts and therefore of GDP, or something that would supplement them rather than substitute them?
So I was probably a bit disappointed in the process that gave us the new system of national accounts because the changes are good but quite small. And the reason I like the comprehensive wealth framework is that for economists who have a theoretical model underlying the system of national accounts, it's a very natural extension of it. So it would completely go with the grain of the system of national accounts. But it does include things that we know are economically important but are hard to measure. So if you wanted to take a very expansive view of comprehensive wealth, you'd include some measure of social capital or institutional capital. We know institutions make a big difference to economic outcomes over the long term. It's one of the things Daron Acemoglu and Simon Johnson won the Nobel Prize for, and we don't have a good way of measuring that. So that's a much more radical extension. So I would think of it as supplementing, but I haven't persuaded the people who take those decisions. It's as you know well, a very cautious process.
So GDP is sort of the big game in town for economists, but there are other people who work on other things. There are happiness indices, and for that matter, there's the sustainable development goals, and there are people who have different metrics. GDPB we talked about today, and beyond GDP. Do you know of anyone who's or group who's working on kind of thinking about how these all connect? I mean, I know that like Betsy Stevenson did some work finding correlations between GDP and happiness. And so they're related, but they're not the same thing. I'd be curious what your thoughts are about these different efforts to capture bits and pieces of what you're describing, some very broadly, but maybe not with much precision, others focusing on one or the other aspects of it, and whether there's a way to connect them all.
There's a real dilemma because we know that there are a lot of things that we care about. And the Sustainable Development Goals would be a great example, something like 300 indicators underlying those. And I think, reasonable people would agree that they're all good things and worth measuring. But if you think about what's the purpose of these kinds of aggregate statistics that we're talking about, it is guiding policy. And so one of the reasons GDP has such sticking power is that it's a clear, if not entirely straightforward, signal of how the economy is doing. It's gone up or it's gone down, and you can compare yourself to other countries and see if you're better off or not. That's really compelling, and it does give a clear signal to policymakers about are they doing the right thing, roughly speaking. So I would think about trying to strike a balance in terms of what's useful, what's going to be useful for policy decisions. That will change over time, and political attention focuses on different bits of the GDP system over time in any case. Sometimes it's balance payments and trade figures, sometimes it's inflation, sometimes it's unemployment. So I don't have a really straightforward answer to you. I'm not a fan of very large dashboards because I think they're not particularly policy useful for this kind of purpose. Nor am I a fan of measuring happiness, not least because economists don't think about it in the way psychologists do, and there's not a good theoretical basis for the kinds of measures that we economists use. So I go back to my quite parsimonious. You've got 6 categories of assets that you might think about. You can fill in as much detail as you want on those, but it seems a good balance.
Yeah, I mean, that point about precision and being able to be consistent about how you measure things is very important. It's a reason not just for GDP, despite all its flaws, but I think of financial accounting and businesses know that it doesn't necessarily exactly capture the true value of all of the different kinds of assets, especially intangibles, but it's something at least they can agree on and measure and compare.
And that point about standards and consensus around a standard is really important and compelling.
Yeah, and when they implement standards, I think they first want to have something that's not easy to game or disagree about. There's just it's clear, even if they know it's not exactly measuring the right thing. So that suggests that of all these different approaches, starting with something that you can clearly replicate and measure is important.
I just was wondering what you thought about the big effort that people are doing on doing green accounting, and particularly from an economic perspective. A lot of it is trying to get the price right, and you really didn't get much into that. But from your perspective, is that a useful way that they're approaching that, and what's the interplay between what the people are doing in green accounting and what you're doing?
Yeah, so I don't touch on it a lot in the book, but I have previously done a fair bit of work on this. So I do think it's important because we use natural resources to produce economic output and to get better off. And some of that we pay for, but quite a lot of it we don't pay for. And therefore, if you want to be sure that future generations have the same kind of living standard as we do, at least as good, that sustainability point, then we need to start thinking about measuring the things that we've not measured, those things that we pretended had a zero price but didn't really. The difficulty becomes then, what price do you attach to them because there's no market? And that's where a lot of the research in environmental accounting is taking place. And the United Nations system calls for using something as close to what would be a market price as possible to make it consistent with the GDP figures. And one of my colleagues at the moment is looking at, well, how might you estimate alternative valuations that take account of all of the externalities involved in the economy? And then you might want to add the risk of catastrophic collapse of a particular forest or atmospheric change and so on. And so that's quite a live debate at the moment in environmental accounting.
I've got one more sort of big question. So Baumel's cost disease describes how sort of the more productive parts of the economy have been shrinking and services and other parts have been growing. Is there an analogous thing happening in measurement where the things that we used to measure really well, tons of steel, bushels of wheat, are becoming less important, and the things that you've brought up here, the intangibles and other aspects of that contribute to our well-being are becoming relatively more important? Do you see something like that happening?
Yes, and it takes me back to my very first book in 1997, which is called The Weightless World, which took off from the observation that GDP was increasing much faster than the literal weight or mass of the economy, not because we're using less materials, but because the economic value being created is intangible value. So in that sense, I think that's absolutely correct. But to go back to the previous question, the material basis still matters as well, or the same with access to rare earths or whatever. So I think, relatively speaking, that's correct. But there is a danger of overlooking the importance of the physical stuff when you do that. There's a great book by a journalist in the UK, Ed Conway, called Material World, which pinpoints these extraordinary bottlenecks in access to materials that underpin the entire digital economy. And it's slightly frightening, actually, how vulnerable we are to some really small bottlenecks.
You mentioned inflation, and I've a question about that. Price of cereal went from $2.50 to $8. Inflation went up 6%. I asked a bunch of financial analysts what comprises inflation, and they go to a website and says, well, it's a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of this, but they don't know what the formula is. So month to month, whoever's calculating it gives us a number, but we really don't have any idea what percentages comes from fuel, what comes from consumer goods, et cetera. So it seems one of the problems is we get these numbers, GDP, inflation, but we really have no idea what comprises it. And doesn't that problem really need to be fixed if people are going to understand what these numbers really mean?
It's a good question. Price indices and inflation measures have always been really controversial. If for the very obvious reason that it's immediately impacting people's living standards, and it affects what wage claims they can make and how pensions get uprated and so on. And so there's no absolute price index. There's no sort of real entity that you're measuring. It's constructed from all of the different prices in the economy and how they change over time. If you're looking at it month to month, actually, you can get a pretty good idea of what's driving short-term changes. It gets much harder when you're thinking about longer-term changes, when the quality of the products changes a lot, when new things become available, when the variety of things that people want to buy changes. And then also, people have very different spending patterns. One way to think about that is to take different bundles of goods. So somebody on a certain income will buy more food, spend more on food and energy, and somebody with a very high income might spend more on going out for dinner and designer clothes and so on. So you can develop different inflation indices and look at how it's impacting different people. But behind your question, I absolutely agree. There is no real entity that is the price index any more than there is a real entity that is GDP. It's not like measuring the length of a river or something of that kind. It's a construct that shapes the way that we look at the world, and that has real consequences for who gets what the distribution is, and what choices people make about business and government.
Are there any policy-oriented groups, any types of governments that are really, or international organizations that you find receptive to some of the things? I mean, everybody wants to make changes, but are they a little more receptive to some of the ideas that you're putting forth, or are we all kind of saying, yeah, we ought to do something, but we don't want to change?
There's a huge amount of interest in it, and the people who were here earlier today are at the forefront of thinking about this. The challenge is that you've kind of all got to, the whole system has to switch to a standard. I think of it as being a bit like if you're changing from the kind of electric sockets we have in the UK to electric sockets in the US. You can only make that kind of change if you've got enough consensus about it. So it's really an organizational question. And as Paul's question earlier indicated, although there's a lot of interest and a lot of people doing work on this time around, there wasn't quite enough impetus to bring about a big change in the way that we measure the economy. But in the Victorian era, it took many years. Developing GDP in the first place took a good 20 years or so. So it's not really surprising that it takes time. And I think there's a widespread recognition that measurement is now really important, and we've got to improve the way that we're doing it.
I just wanted to add on a little bit to the communication aspect about GDP or prices. I think there is a bit of a trade-off in the sense that the further you want to give credit to, say, quality improvement or intangibles, in short, things that are not observable transactions, the harder it can be to get the message across to the users of data, to the point that statistics may lose credibility. Okay? If you say, well, yes, the observed price of a product has gone up, but actually, quality adjusted, it has gone down, people will just say, this is just wrong information. I don't believe this. Or welfare in the sense of generating imputed income or consumption. So I think there's a bit of a balance to be struck between what is possible in what I would call the political economy of statistics, so that things remain acceptable in the public perception, and while still being credible also from an academic perspective.
No, I think that's a great point. And even if the quality adjusted price goes down, you've still got to pay the ticket price for it.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you, Diane. I really appreciate you taking the time, flying all the way out here and speaking at 1 a.m. UK time. The book is Measure of Progress, Counting What Really Matters. You guys have a copy, but I don't think all your friends and family do yet. So I'm sure it's available at better bookstores everywhere. Thanks a lot, Diane. And the next talk, Daniela Roos will be coming over not quite as far from MIT, speaking on Tuesday the 8th, back to our usual time on Mondays. So hope to see you then. Thanks. Bye.